Hello, everyone, and welcome to this special event for Asia Society members, and an event which is a long-standing and really rich Asia Society tradition. I'm Tom Nagorski, Executive Vice President at the Asia Society. For more than 15 years now, we have been the proud stewards of the Osborn Elliott Prize for Excellence in Journalism about Asia. Osborn Elliott, many of you will know, known as Oz Elliott, was one of the great journalists and editors of his time. He was also an early practitioner and champion of what came to be known as civic journalism. And among many other affiliations and roles outside of journalism, Oz Elliott was a trustee of the Asia Society, our longtime friend, and this prize was established in his name. We at the Society do not actually choose the prize winners. That task goes to a jury that does the work of soliciting nominations and then sifting through all the great journalism done in the prior year. You can see at asiasociety.org all the past prize winners, which is also, of course, where you can find everything you need to know about upcoming events at the Asia Society, and in particular across our global online platform. And in a moment, you'll hear all about the work that is being honored this year and the woman who is receiving the 2021 Oz Elliott Prize today. And to kick things off, we have two longstanding friends of the institution, also regular participants in this tradition, to lead the event. In a moment, Dorinda Elliott, longtime journalist herself, and now Director of Programming and Senior Vice President at the China Institute, also the daughter of Oz Elliott, will moderate a special conversation with this year's winner. But first, to tell us about not only the 2021 winner, but also a little bit about how the selection process unfolded. It is always difficult because there's always an awful lot of great work that comes in. Is the chair of the jury, Marcus Brauchli. Marcus has been a correspondent in Asia for many years. He then rose to serve as editor of both the Wall Street Journal and the Washington Post. He's co-founder of North Base Media. Marcus, as I say every year, we thank you greatly for all you do to lead the Oz Elliott Prize jury. We welcome you back to this event. Turn it over to you. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Tom. Good morning, everyone from Boulder, Colorado. Let me join Tom in thanking you for being here and congratulating Alice for winning the Oz Prize this year. We have an excellent program planned with her today. I've had the honor to chair this jury now, as Tom says, for several years, succeeding my good friend Norm Pearlstein, who I believe may be on this call today. Since the Oz Prize started, we've seen the caliber and range of entries consistently improve. It has never failed to impress us. We've had video, audio, photographic, and of course, text entries from global and local outlets alike. This year's submissions included a remarkable study of satellite imagery of the Uyghur detention camps in Western China, meticulous reconstructions of incidents in India that carried profound political implications, one a pogrom against Muslims, the other the murder of a lower caste woman. What tied all of the journalism together, though, was its ambition to tackle important, complicated stories that matter, to be, as the founders of this prize honoring Osborn Elliott intended, the best examples of journalism about Asia each year. This year's winner, Alice Su, was judged to be exactly that. Alice is the Beijing bureau chief of the Los Angeles Times, has been based there for 3 years. Last year, she traversed China in pursuit of stories that, to quote the nominating letter from managing editor Scott Kraft, put a focus on individual lives, their hopes, losses, and the courage it took for each one of them to speak in a dark year under a suffocating regime. Her work challenged Chinese propaganda by illuminating the human cost of sweeping government policies and the pain of those who lived and died beneath them. The Oz Prize jury felt she showed great courage in her reporting, defying state controls and intimidation of foreign journalists, even as other reporters were being expelled or denied visas. You'll hear much more in a minute from Alice, who will be in conversation with my good friend and fellow juror, Dorinda Elliott, herself, like me, a former China correspondent. It will be fascinating to hear how much has changed in the generation since Dorinda and I covered China, and forgive me, Dorinda, for pointing out that link. Last year, of course, was an exceptional year to cover China. In the first week of January, the Wall Street Journal reported that Chinese officials were scrambling to decide how they should respond to a novel coronavirus that had emerged in Wuhan. In the following months, the Associated Press, the New York Times, and the Journal all dispatched reporters to Wuhan, where they risked not only getting what we now know as COVID-19, but also detention and even expulsion by the authorities. Alice, too, went to Wuhan. Their reporting into the origins and mishandling of the crisis showed the importance and power of clear-eyed and independent journalists in China. And the Oz Prize jury specifically cited those organizations for their courageous and important work. I'm sure it goes without saying to this audience that covering modern China has never been easy. Just over 4 decades ago, diplomatic ties between the US and the communist government in China were established. Each country allowed resident correspondents from the other. Both countries set out rules that constrained the movement and activities of reporters. Much has changed over those last 4 decades. But unfortunately, much has also regressed in recent years. As you all know, both countries have engaged in counterproductive Cold War-style tit-for-tat expulsions of journalists in the last couple of years. The Oz Prize jury deplores those moves and believes it is in the world's interests and the interests of people in both the US and China for journalists to be able to conduct journalism freely and without intimidation. We are fortunate today to have with us Alice Su, who is working in China, and Dinda, Oz Elliott's daughter, who began covering China in the mid-1980s, first for Business Week, then Newsweek, and years later as editor of Asia Week. Their perspectives, I'm sure, will be illuminating, and I'll hand this over now to Dinda for a conversation with Alice. Thank you.
Wonderful. Okay, well, thank you, Marcus, and thank you, Tom. And firstly, Alice, congratulations. I will just say that as Oz's daughter, I know he would have been so delighted and so proud that you won this year's Oz Prize. So, you know, the humanity in your stories resonated with all of us judges so much, and not to mention the enterprise of tackling this enormous breadth of stories all on your own without a huge team of other reporters around you. Not to mention the degree of difficulty and the danger involved in doing much of the reporting. But what especially came through to all of us is the idea that China is about so much more than government policies. So congratulations, and let's jump into, we want to learn about your life and about your work. So Alice, why don't you first tell us a little bit about this past year? It has not been an easy one. And so I want you to tell us a little, what has it been like for journalists in China this year?
Yeah. Well, thank you so much. It's a really big honor. And this prize was I told Marcus, it was a much needed encouragement for me after indeed a really tough year. And, I don't want to, I'm very privileged and I'm lucky to be healthy and to be here and to be employed. And it was a tough year for the whole world. So I acknowledge that. But I think for a lot of journalists in China, there was just kind of a series of escalations that happened throughout the year that caused a lot of anxiety. And to be honest, kind of things have not really cooled down. So I think, first there was COVID. That was a big story. It was intense. It was scary, but, it's a story and we can cover it. But I think early on in the year, journalists started getting expelled from China. First, there were 3 Wall Street Journal reporters, and I know everyone at the Asia Society already knows all of this. So yeah, in March,
our audience doesn't know. So keep going. Yeah.
Oh, okay.
That's great.
So there were 3 Wall Street Journal reporters who got their visas revoked first because of an opinions article that came out in the journal calling China the sick man of Asia. And that was supposedly the reason why they had to leave. And then in March, there was one day when all the American reporters for the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, and the Washington Post were expelled at once. And that was already, it caused a lot of worry in the foreign correspondence community, just because we were thinking, who's going to be next? Is this going to escalate? But I think what added to the pressure was later on in the year, there was kind of a shift in terms of what people were worried about. I think for a long time for foreign correspondents, we've thought, the worst thing that can happen to us is we will lose our visas and we'll leave. But really, we're more worried about our sources because they're here and they stay, and much worse things can happen to them. But last year in August, an Australian reporter who works for state media for CGTN, her name is Chung Lei, and she was detained. she's still in detention now, and most of us didn't know about it until September. She was detained on national security grounds, but the details are still really unclear. And then that happened, and I think about a week after the news came out about Chunglei, there were 2 Australian reporters who had security officers show up at their doors in the middle of the night and told them they were not allowed to leave China. They were under an exit ban. So they actually went to the Australian embassy and lived there for a few days, I think almost a week. And then it was only through negotiation by the diplomats that they managed to, they agreed to be questioned, and then they were able to go back to Australia. And then once they arrived, they let us know. Then we all found out, everybody who was left found out that that had happened. And it was only a few weeks or even a month. I don't remember exactly when, but later on we found out that that had happened possibly because prior to what happened to the 2 Australians, in Australia, there had been security raids on Chinese journalists' homes. So I think for a lot of us, especially Americans, or especially citizens of any country that was having tension with China, which was a lot of countries last year, but for the US, things were really escalating. So there was this very real fear for a lot of us that, we could just become pawns in a kind of hostage situation. And if something happens in our home country that we may not know about, there could be very quick retaliation on us. And in December, there was also another detention of a Chinese reporter for Bloomberg. I think technically she's a researcher because she's not allowed to be a reporter. But yeah, I think this kind of escalation and us seeing that and thinking, coming to terms with the reality that something worse than expulsion could happen to us, that has caused a lot of pressure.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That's a tremendous amount of pressure. I can't even really imagine what it's like to, work under those kinds of pressures. But tell us a little bit also about your own background and how that might give you a slightly different perspective from other so-called, foreign journalists.
Yeah.
Because you grew up in China.
Yeah, we talked about this earlier. So I've been in China before. I came to China in early 2019 with the LA Times on a journalist visa. But prior to that, my parents immigrated to the US from Taiwan in graduate school. So I was born in California, and then I grew up between Hong Kong, Taiwan, California, and Shanghai. So I had gone to high school in Shanghai. I'd gone to a local school for 2 years, and then I went to an Shanghai American school. So I've experienced life as an expat child. And later on, I was in the Middle East before this, but I took a year as well to come and do a master's in China studies at Peking University. So I have experienced life here as a student and as kind of just, a foreigner in a foreigner's bubble. And then I've experienced it as a journalist. And I think it's interesting to me, just as soon as you're here on a J visa, the experience becomes very different, and it almost is like you're walking around with a target on your back. But and sometimes I wish I wasn't here on a J visa, but then, then I wouldn't be able to report. But I think having been here with other identities helps me to see that, it gave me this sense even before I came that I knew I didn't want to be here in an adversarial way. I didn't, I saw my work as, I want to understand what's happening in China, and I wanted to seek accountability and, of course, do reporting that speaks truth to power and all of that. But I didn't see myself kind of as, initially, I didn't see myself as an enemy of the authorities. Right. And I do think that kind of, at the same time, being treated that way, like an automatic enemy because you're a Westerner, I think it really affects a lot of people's reporting and makes it very hard to not want to fight back and expose things.
I know I've often felt that almost by definition, when you are a journalist in China, you're kind of destined to see the dark side of China more than just regular folks do. And particularly because the government is chasing you all the time. But so another quick question before we jump into your actual reporting. So being an Asian American must also help you kind of slip into situations where you're not as easily noticed as a non-Asian reporter, right?
Yeah, for sure. I think that helps a lot. I think it's always helped, but I think, oh, sorry. Did you want to say something?
No, go ahead. Yeah.
I was just going to say, especially in recent years, in the last 1 or 2 years, when it's become a lot more dangerous for Chinese staff of foreign news organizations to be involved on sensitive stories. And also as the scope of what's considered sensitive has considerably expanded, it's a great advantage to be able to get around on my own and not have to involve them. Sometimes it can be a disadvantage. Well, it's an advantage in terms of I'm not noticed as easily and people trust me faster and I speak to them and they tell me things. And so obviously that's an advantage, but sometimes in initial encounters with security figures, it can be negative. They can they can sometimes treat me in a rougher way initially because they think I'm Chinese. So there are pros and cons, more pros.
Yeah, sure. Yeah, absolutely. So you did a lot of the stories in your package this year were about reporting in Mongolia, Xinjiang, and on the Hui Muslims in Gansu. So tell us a little bit about the degree of difficulty in that reporting, and and then I'd love you to talk a little bit about the Chinese government seems to be embarked on this project of kind of Hanification, right? It's like just their, policies towards the minorities are to sort of sinicize them. And I'm just wondering why you think that's happening. Talk about that a little bit.
Okay, well, the degree of difficulty.
Firstly, tell us a little bit about the difficulty and also tell us a little bit about what you found in Mongolia and in Gansu, for example, because we know quite a bit about, we've all read about Xinjiang. We've read less, I think, about Gansu and Mongolia. So tell us a little bit about what you found.
Okay, well, I'll start with Inner Mongolia. So I went there last year in September 1st. And I went because I had been reading and seeing these videos being sent online about protests that were happening across the region. And what was happening was that the authorities there had decided to make a sudden change to the school curriculum and to change a portion of some elementary school classes from Mongolian language to Mandarin. And, parents were upset about it, students were upset about it. And I decided to just go and see if I could talk to anyone. And I decided to go on the day that policy was going to be implemented. So the first day of school. And it wasn't that hard actually to get there. I took a train from Beijing, and I think in some ways the local authorities were not prepared and they didn't realize that journalists were paying attention or were going to come and see what they were doing. And I was able to go to a few schools. I was able to kind of contrast these Han Chinese schools versus the minority language schools. And in the Han Chinese schools, they're very normal. The parents didn't even know that there was a conflict going on over this policy change. And in front of the Mongolian schools, there was a really heavy security presence. I actually got there around lunchtime. And so later on, I saw as it was time for the kids to come back after lunch. And I saw a lot of, like SWAT vehicles, police officers standing around in the front. And I just decided to go up and try to talk to some of the parents and grandparents who were there. I spoke to this grandfather who was kind of standing behind a tree crying and I was able to, do quick interviews, but within a few minutes, I was surrounded by security officers, and they took me to a police station and then took me to this room kind of behind the station. And I had this very unpleasant experience with them and this is where, again, I say that was one of those experiences where I think maybe having a Chinese face didn't help, but because they were just very hostile to me and a little bit violent. And one of these plainclothes guys put me into a cell basically and locked me in a cell. And I don't really want to go into the details, but it was a very harsh experience. yeah, scary. And it was the day I had learned about Chung Lei, the Australian woman. So I was sitting there thinking, like, oh no, like, am I going to be the American? Like, I don't want to be the American. But it was a worthwhile trip. And out of that trip, I was able to get, a really strong story. And I was able to also include sources from the region who spoke to me in a really courageous and honest way about what was happening. Yeah. So that was that.
Were you able to stay after the detention?
Oh, no, they detained me for maybe 4 hours or so, first in the cell. And then after an hour or so, I think someone realized, we shouldn't, this is a real foreigner, we shouldn't put her in the cell. And then they moved me to a conference room and gave me a bottle of water. And then I was there for a bit. And then towards the end, they came and took statements from me, and then they escorted me to a train station and bought me a McDonald's burger. They bought me a burger and then stood on the platform until my train left to make sure that I was gone. Yeah. So,
why was the grandfather crying?
Just because he was just saying, we should have a right to learn our own language, and they were saying that the parents were being threatened. Basically the children and the students and their parents were angry because this policy was implemented so quickly and with no consultation. And there's also a lot of background to this, where they felt like, their culture, their way of life is slowly being eroded and becoming this Han Chinese culture instead. And when they protested, they were met with a security crackdown. And that is not just what you imagine in terms of Western protests. It's not just, police and tear gas and so on, but they're also being threatened. Parents are being told, if your child doesn't show up tomorrow at school, you will not have your job anymore. And what I learned from a source there was that people who had participated in protests, and in the weeks following, we saw that Inner Mongolian police stations published, online photos of people's faces they had taken with surveillance cameras at protests. And basically they're saying, we know everybody who participated, and if you've been involved, you will be marked as a key individual, as a, 重点人物, and in this system that they have. And kind of, it's going to affect the rest of your life and your access to, like your access to even things like, buying a house, things like that. So they were upset because they had tried to resist and they were not given the space to. And so they were just complying with something.
And how do you explain the government's campaign to sort of homogenize or Hanicize or Sinicize society? How do you see that?
Yeah, it's something really interesting, and it's something that's new in recent years, because, and especially with Inner Mongolia, it was interesting because the Mongolians have been seen as kind of a model minority, like, oh, they have integrated really well, they speak Chinese, they don't, make problems like Tibetans or Uyghurs do. But in recent years, there has been this kind of rethink of ethnic policy in China. So previously, Mao era policy allowed a lot of ethnic groups to have their own autonomous regions, and they were guaranteed the right to preserve their language, their culture, to have their own education. But in recent years, there has been this. First, there were kind of these scholars who were saying, oh, China, it's interesting because in China, they speak about it as, we're learning from the American model. Actually, they say, oh, we need to have a melting pot system where people put their Chinese national identity above their ethnic identity. But if you kind of think about it a little bit more, it's problematic to say that too, because in the US, your American identity is closely tied with citizenship and the idea of rights and responsibilities. And here, they're not going to say, well, it's not that you're all tied together by your equal rights as citizens and your, allegiance to the Constitution. But here, kind of the primary unifying tool is things like language, everyone needs to speak Mandarin, and patriotism and Xi Jinping thought and ideology. So it is interesting, and I think it is part of the Xi era is this drive towards unification and making everyone embrace tightly like the seeds of a pomegranate, which is what you see, like the slogan that you see on everywhere, that there are minorities in China. So yeah, it's about being one.
They use that analogy, the seeds of a pomegranate.
Oh yeah, it's everywhere. It's all the ethnicities must embrace tightly like the seeds of a pomegranate.
Wow. Okay, so,
yeah.
So this leads perfectly to my next question, which was going to be about Xi Jinping. So you wrote a wonderful, brilliant analytical piece about Xi Jinping, and I'm really curious as to what you think is his kind of driving motivation. We in the West, we in the States, tend to see him as a kind of a dictator who's power hungry, and there are all these oppressive policies, et cetera. Do you think that's the right way to see him, or how do you sort of, look at him and what's the motivation for his policies?
Yeah.
Because we know that since he came in, there has been this rethink of minority policies. There's been a drive towards, unification, as you said. So tell us what you think is the driving motivation.
I do think it's a little bit reductive. Well, it's not inaccurate to say, he's a dictator. He wants power. He wants control. But it's a little bit reductive. And okay. I think, when I was researching this piece, actually, I was really intimidated by that piece. It was my editor's idea. And then I was like, how can I do this? What do you mean? He's like, just tell us about him. But as I was,
it's great reporting and great analysis. So go ahead, keep going.
Yeah. And I was, just as I was researching more about him and talking to, intellectuals and historians and people here in Beijing who are of his generation, I think what was really surprising to me is that people who know what they're talking about say that, he is really an ideologue. He's really a true believer. And he is somebody who doesn't just want power for the sake of power. In a lot of countries, an autocrat doesn't care what happens to the country, right? They just want power for themselves. But he's someone who wants power and wants to kind of redeem the Communist Party, bring it back to its original intentions, restore faith in the party, and fulfill an inevitable historical mission of China's greatness, China's rise to prove once and for all that, China's system is superior to Western systems. And right. he kind of sees himself as kind of this redemptive figure who is bringing everyone back to their true beliefs. And I actually wanted to share this. I was thinking today, because we just had Dragon Boat Festival, right? So, we all eat zongzi, like the glutinous rice dumplings. And there's this story that Xi Jinping really likes to share. And it's about, he's saying, in the 1920s, there was a Chinese man who was the first translator of the Communist Manifesto. And one day he was working on his translation and eating his zongzi. And his mom was saying, "Oh, are you hungry?" And he said, "No, I'm not hungry." And then when she came out, she saw him and his face was covered with ink. It was like ink smeared all over. And she said, "What is this?" And it turned out that he had taken the zongzi and instead of dipping it in, sugar, he had dipped it in the ink. And he said something like, "Oh, how sweet is the taste of truth." How wow. And you can look that up. He's told that story many times. And that's something a historian here in Beijing pointed out to me. And he said the first time we heard Xi tell that story, we all were incredulous. And we were thinking kind of are you serious? But he tells it in an unironic way. He tells it to kind of convey what he hopes, which is, we should all be like that man. And we should all feel full of ideological fervor and kind of return to the way that his generation was in the 60s, truly passionate, true believers. And so I think kind of that's how we should understand him. And that's how he talks about himself. And that's how he explains himself. So
right. And it's sort of the belief that only the Communist Party can save China. So it's a profoundly patriotic thing.
Yeah, profoundly patriotic, but at the same time, so I went to Yan'an and I went to Liangjia, the village where he was sent down as a youth, and it's really interesting because last year China was doing this internal purge of the disciplinary bodies, and the official voices were saying, this is going to be, well, if they're saying we're going to turn a knife inward and scrape the bone and basically purge anybody who is not loyal, and even though we're 8 years in at that point, we still think there are disloyal people within our system, we're going to purge them, and this is going to be like the Yan'an rectification of 1942. So I went to Yan'an and I watched a musical about all these happy, inspired youth coming together and for communist ideology. But when I read kind of true histories of what happened there, I also saw there are all these tactics that Mao kind of adopted from the Soviets and then developed in a Chinese context, struggle sessions,
right.
self-criticism, and these are the things that, so on the one hand, he's saying, let's go back to our original belief, but he's also saying, the way he's doing it is also kind of these original, very strong, forceful, quite scary tactics.
Yes.
And other things, sorry, I just have a lot to say about it, but one more thing is just that, a lot of people compare him to Mao, but he's also very different from Mao. Like maybe he's similar in terms of he has that ideological bent, but his tactics, he's someone who loves discipline, who strictly believes in order and control, and I think would never do something like, unleashing grassroots chaos in order to secure his own position. Well, I don't know. I shouldn't say it would never, because we don't know what would happen, but all the indications are that very different in terms of his style. Also
having experienced the Cultural Revolution, of course, he knows what chaos brings. It's so fascinating. You mentioned Yan'an and rectification because there's a recently kind of newly published English translation of a Chinese scholar's work on the rectification campaign. It's translated by Stacy Mosher and it's a deeply embarrassing moment because it does reveal the kind of ruthless tactics that were evident, way back in Yan'an. But so let's jump forward. I'm going to jump into, the kind of questions of what you wrestle with as a reporter covering China. So I'm really curious as to how you strike the right balance between reporting on government oppression, right, which has certainly increased over minority peoples, Muslims, and free-thinking intellectuals and dissidents in recent years, and the quote unquote other China, which is the China that most Chinese people live in. When we were chatting before this event, you said that you feel that in a way there are two Chinas, in a funny way. That there's one in which people are satisfied and proud to be Chinese. They like Xi Jinping because he makes them feel proud for the first time, ever. And one in which individuals are oppressed. So can you talk about that a little bit? How do you sort of square those two?
Yeah, I struggle with that a lot. And I think for me, as a one-person bureau with limited capacity, I have to decide, what we prioritize. And I think it comes down to, in some ways, I felt that my purpose here was really clarified last year when so many other journalists had to leave. So I feel that with limited capacity, I should focus on stories that will not be told if they're not told by a foreigner or by someone who's here on the ground. I do think, if Americans, like if an LA Times reader doesn't know anything about China except for what they read from my stories, I do worry like, oh, will they think what if they actually come to China, maybe they'll be really surprised, and they'll say, oh my God, you're always writing about these oppressed minorities and no freedom of speech and so on. But I just see like yoga classes, yoga in the park, and people at cafes and bars, and high rises in Shanghai, and yeah, there can be a big gap there. But
Alice, is that China that people see when they visit? Is that a false China, or is it also?
It's not a false China. Yeah, it's not a false China, and actually, it's a China that many people live in. And I think I am trying to plan more stories where I can get this across, that there are kind of two Chinas. There are two worlds that you live in. And even as journalists, we live in two Chinas at the same time, because one moment we're talking to someone who is under house arrest, and the next moment we're going out to dinner and having a normal time. But I want to try to convey in my stories kind of that, to me, what matters is that moment when a person drops from one China to the other one, and typically that happens when something happens to them or their family. And it doesn't have to be like, oh, they went out for a protest. It can be there was an explosion next to their house, or they were in a city that suddenly got locked down because of this pandemic, and now their mom is dying, and now the government hotlines aren't working, and when they complain about it online, people are saying, oh, you must be backed by foreign forces. And I've done so many interviews just over the last few years of people who sometimes always have this kind of defensive self-explaining tendency to say, I'm a good citizen and I've never done anything wrong, and I've always believed everything I see on TV and everything like CCTV says, but I just don't know why now suddenly, because I don't know, even last week, 2 weeks ago, when there was this horrible race in Gansu and 21 people died, there was a young girl whose father died, and she was on Weibo asking for help and saying, I need to know what happened to my dad. And then people attacked her and said, why are you complaining? Are there foreign forces behind you? And so a lot of people, I think kind of the majority, I don't know. I think most people, a lot of them, they live in this kind of, happy, like not happy, but, just satisfied world. And those people who are dissidents or who complain or petition, they're kind of seen as crazy, crazy or foreign backed. And we don't need to think about them or worry about them. The majority, our lives are getting better and better. But then when something happens, when a person becomes a victim, then they also become a target of stability maintenance. And that's when they suddenly realize, oh, this is why it matters to protect individuals, or like, this is why it matters to be in a system where individuals matter. Whereas before they might just think, well, what matters is the majority, and I'm always going to be in the majority, there is this, I wrestle with this a lot, but I do want to try to kind of capture both worlds. And for me, I think what's interesting is the psychology and also how a person can change depending on what they've experienced.
That's so fascinating and so profound, Alice. I mean, and, you just alluded to it, the Wuhan, tragedy, when people were just suffering so much, and you did just amazingly moving reporting on that. And that moment when people made that transition was like, oh my God, I always believed that things would be okay and things were great. But suddenly as an individual, my father is dying and nobody's helping me. So they would sort of slide into that other world.
Yeah. But also in that story, in the same story, I talked to people who, because I didn't go to Wuhan initially during the initial lockdown. I went afterwards, after it opened up. So at that time, it's just really interesting. Like it's just crazy. What happened last year, there was like, people were like, oh, is this the mandate of heaven moment? But then within a few months, like, oh no, it's the mandate of heaven moment for the US or for many other countries. So kind of by the time I went in May, the coronavirus had spread to many other countries, and everyone could see, even without propaganda, everyone could see kind of how poor the response was in other places. And so in my story, I also had this construction worker who kind of called himself like an awakened person, and he had always been a little bit of a distrustful of authorities. And during the lockdown, he took great risks to go and take videos of the temporary hospitals, the temporary quarantine centers, and so on. But then a month or two later, he kind of saw what was happening in the US and was really confused and was just kind of questioning, like what is going on. And to him, it was kind of like he'd been distrustful of authorities here, and he had seen some other countries as, lighthouses and beacons of hope. And then suddenly those systems seemed to be failing, and this system seemed to be working really well. And he's just honest with me that he was wrestling with that. And I thought, we should include this is great. Like, this is really good for the story.
Right. So fascinating. That's why actually we thought that your reporting on Wuhan was kind of deeper than a lot of people, broke stories and all that stuff, but yours kind of captured the totality of that arc. The sort of moving from the, oh my God, my government, my country's letting me down, we're dying, to then marveling at, oh my God, how could it be that we're doing so much better than they're doing in America? So it was just fantastic. Yeah. But so I just wanted to point out, because I think it's fascinating, there are some statistics to back up what you were saying about this sort of two Chinas idea. Like there was a 2016 study by Harvard's Ash Center, which was a longitudinal survey done over 15 years of public opinion. And it showed that 95.5% of respondents were either, quote unquote, relatively satisfied or highly satisfied with the government in Beijing. And I mean, I find that astounding, right? And COVID actually has increased people's happiness with their government. So it's just such a fascinating thing, and I think a point that we in America miss. So, we really miss that point, which is that there are these two realities in China. So I wanted to ask you a couple more questions, then we're going to take some from the audience. But so philosophically, China is and always has been a country in which the majority is what matters most, not the individual, right? And I remember when I was a reporter back in Beijing in the late 80s, a million years ago, and through the student movement of 1989, the crackdown and beyond, we thought it was inevitable. You won't believe this, but we thought it was inevitable that China would follow a more pluralistic model. I mean, there were even people betting on when the Communist Party will fall. The support from the general population was for that movement was so widespread at that time. And it certainly seems like we got those predictions wrong. So I'm really curious about what direction you think China is going in now. I mean, I know that's a tough question. Nobody can predict the future, but what do you think, given that sort of emphasis on the majority and, is China's system we often in America think that China inevitably should or will follow an American system, but it's not happening. So, and yet you've got 95% of the people who are happy with their government. So how do you see, how do you sort of make sense of it all?
Yeah. Well, first of all, I don't think I can predict what's going to happen. And I also don't think I can prescribe what's going to happen in China. But I can say that, I don't know, that survey, I cited it in one of my stories. So I've read it. But I guess I would also take it with a grain of salt, because I guess something I think about a lot is just that, Chinese people are smart and Chinese people are political survivors, and they know, they know what is beneficial and what has absolutely no benefit. Things like talking to foreign journalists these days has no benefit for most Chinese people. And answering on a survey that you're not satisfied doesn't really have benefit. Something else I've noticed.
That's a good point. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, something else I'm thinking is like when I'm out reporting, even one of the stories I submitted for this prize was from the floods last year in rural areas. Like I noticed that wherever you go, people have complaints, but they tend to direct them towards the local government, and they tend to say, it's always, and maybe this is an ancient way. I know that it's kind of, these local officials are horrible and corrupt and bad, but, the center is good, the emperor is good, and Beijing is good. And I know those policies are good and we support them, but they're not, the benefit is not reaching us. And it's because of the local, these direct guys that we know and that we've seen. So I kind of think that could also be something that is altering the way that people respond. Something else I would think, I don't know if China is going to change, but I do think that there are very few signs right now of any willingness. I think that the current authorities are very, very clear on where they want to go, and they haven't shown any signs of backing down. And they especially haven't shown signs of backing down because of criticism from the West. In some ways, it's almost like, well, we don't really care what the West thinks anymore. At the same time, I think there are a lot of problems in China, and there are a lot of people who genuinely care about those problems and want to do something about them, and they don't have to be necessarily political. They can be, like, this year I did a story about a delivery driver who set himself on fire, wow. a delivery guy over unpaid wages. And I remember I wasn't able to meet him or his family, but I went to the small town, Taizhou, where it happened. And I interviewed a bunch of drivers there, and they told me, like, we are being exploited and we have so many problems, but we are just a big sheet of loose sand, and we're all atomized individuals, and there's no way we can kind of organize to change anything, not to, change the government or overthrow anything, but even just to kind of ask for something better on a small scale.
Wow. Yeah. I have to look that up. I'm thinking, isn't that something that Lu Xun or somebody way back when used, is that idea of a sheet of loose sand? That's fascinating.
Yeah,
but
I think Sun said it, actually.
Okay.
I think it's like a recurring theme. Yeah.
Yeah.
And I heard it from a YMI driver, like a delivery guy.
There you go. And that idea of the Chinese being political survivors, I think, is so brilliant. And I always feel like you have to understand why people are, might even love Xi Jinping. You have to understand where they've come from, which is that, they endured 40 years of communist, terrible political upheaval and starvation and cultural revolution and chaos, right? And then they've had 40 years of basically stability where life has been getting better and stable. And so it's like, from that perspective, if you put yourself in their shoes, it's hard for us Americans to understand, because we have such a completely different history, completely different value system. Yeah. But you can sort of begin to understand, what they're thinking. So let's take some questions from the audience. We have one from another wonderful China expert, Peggy Blumenthal, who's an expert on Chinese education. And she's asking, are Chinese university students generally supportive of Xi or just quietly obedient? Will more young people want to study abroad, or are they content to study in the increasingly politicized PRC universities? Any thoughts on that? What are Chinese university students thinking?
Yeah, well, it's hard to say, because I think there's a wide range of different kinds of people at universities. I did a story. Oh, actually, I have a really good response to this. I just realized from my story. Because I did a story last year about university professors who are under increasing pressure. And
Zhang Run, wonderful leading intellectual.
And I wrote about a Fudan University professor who was teaching Cultural Revolution history, and then she was reported kind of tattled on by her own students. And they kind of like stuck a big poster on her door, and it was really shocking to her, because it was kind of like, this is what I'm teaching you about, not something to repeat, but it's something that happened. So on the one hand, there are students like that who are very, very nationalist and are kind of, and some of them sometimes, like, they do have exposure to the outside world and have studied abroad, and they go to California and they see homelessness and they think, this sucks, and, China is so great. And they don't know much about their own real history. And they're really, they're kind of, they're very pink, when we say here, self and home, they're like little, like they're very, they have that ideology. At the same time, there are other students who are really, really active in kind of, they're activists, but they're not like 1989 activists, they're not talking about democracy or change, but they're really upset about things like exploitation of tech workers, Me Too. They're upset about sexual harassment. They want more rights for women. So they organize around these kind of social issues that are in some ways very different. But, they're aware I kind of, but the story I wanted to tell you was about this thing that happened in 2019, December in Fudan. So basically, Fudan University, they made a change to the school charter and they removed a clause, a part that talked about critical thinking. And I think also freedom of speech. I don't remember, but at least critical thinking. And then there was a group of students who went to the cafeteria and decided to sing the school anthem in protest. And the professor who I interviewed from that university was telling me, he's like, if you look at that scene in that school, in the cafeteria, there's 3 groups of people. So there are the students who are singing out loud, taking a huge risk. Then there are the students who are kind of filming them, saying nothing, but filming, and they're going to share it later. And then there's a whole bunch of students that are sitting there with their heads down, eating lunch and pretending like nothing is happening. But, everyone in the room knows what is going on, but a large proportion are the ones who are just there to eat and are just going to get their degree and are, they're not going to do anything. So she kind of was saying that that's similar to kind of the range of people and the way they're reacting to what's happening in China today.
Yeah. Do you think, I don't know, maybe you haven't done reporting on this yet, but what about students' views of going to study overseas and study in the States, given that the perspectives on the States have changed?
Yeah, I haven't done in-depth reporting on it. My impression is that, so I guess this would be just not backed up by any quantitative analysis, but my impression just from recent months is that, like foreign schools, American schools, Western universities are still seen as better schools, more prestigious and, better for your resume. But at the same time, there are a lot of benefits to being here in China. China's kind of increasingly becoming like less friendly to foreigners, more friendly to people who want to come back and bring your skills, especially if you're like an engineer who can help with the semiconductor development or AI. And I think in recent months, kind of the rise in racism and anti-Asian attacks, last year, kind of the hostility towards Chinese students, and in some cases Chinese professors, and hostility in general towards Chinese people, and now also Asian people. I think that affects a lot of students' decisions, or just when they're thinking, how hard is it going to be to get my visa? And then secondly, can I get a job after that? And then thirdly, is someone going to spit on me or attack me on the street? I think people are really aware and worried about that.
Right. And the reality, I might add, is that it's almost impossible to get a visa these days. I mean, it is so damn difficult to get a visa to study in the States. So a couple more questions. And then after we're done with this, I want to allow Norm Pearlstein, who's with us today, to speak for a moment. First, but first, you bring in a star-studded audience, Alice. But first, I've got a question from another star, Barbara Demick, who was one of the winners of the Oz Prize for her reporting on Korea a number of years ago. And Barbara wrote a wonderful, fabulous book last year about Tibet, which I'm sure you know about. But
my role model, Barbara.
Yes. So Barbara's asking, when I was traveling through China, I used to think the party was generally more popular in Shanghai and Beijing, where people are the winners in society, than in the countryside, where people feel left behind. And she's asking, I wonder, though, if that has changed under Xi Jinping. How would you assess his popularity? And do you feel people are more hostile to Americans these days? That's 2 questions. So first, how would you assess Xi Jinping's popularity? And, has it shifted? If people used to, if he used to be more popular in Shanghai, the big successful cities, Shanghai, Beijing, et cetera, has that shifted? What are people in the countryside thinking?
It's hard to say. I mean, I think I want to say that it seems like he is popular, or at least the policies that he's done are popular in the countryside, things like poverty alleviation and, bringing a lot of positive change. But like when I've been reporting, I have met a lot of individual exceptions to that, who have these big policies happening to them, not necessarily because and don't necessarily want it to happen. Like even in that Gansu trip that I didn't get to talk about earlier, but I actually went, it was a government kind of state organized trip to look at poverty alleviation. And I met, the guy that they had arranged for us to interview, who was saying like, oh, everything is so great. We have moved, we are so happy. But I also met quite a few individuals who had different complaints, or some of them not complaints, but just kind of saying kind of this very common view I hear in the countryside, which is there is a great trend and I cannot do anything about it. I just follow the trend, so like I was living in my village. I was a migrant worker. Now suddenly I have been moved to this new building. I still come back here to do construction and, I'm making the same income. So, the trend has happened and not necessarily, very happy or enthusiastic about changes that have happened. I do think that among intellectuals in Shanghai and Beijing, there is, I don't think he is very popular. But it's something that I also mentioned in that story, the profile I wrote, is that this kind of, and this is something I heard from an intellectual in Beijing, which is, this is exactly his worldview, which is that, I'm going to do things that will upset you, intellectuals and foreigners, but the people will be happy because I'm doing what's good for the broader people. But again, it's hard to tell. And it's hard to tell.
Yeah. So I guess my last question before I'll ask Norm to speak and then hand it back to Tom Nagorski. But what do you think Americans get wrong about China? I mean, it's probably hard for you to assess that since you're sitting in Beijing, but do you think, is there one message that you think we need to better understand about China?
It is hard to, I think it depends on what kind of Americans, because it seems to me there are a lot of Americans with varying views on China. I think
the view from Washington, for example, is that Beijing is essentially emerging as certainly an adversary, if not an enemy. And I'm curious as to whether, and that we also flip-flop in America between China's going to destroy us, right? The rise of China is going to be bad for America, to China is incredibly poor and, not developed. It's just like sort of this back and forth.
I don't know. Yeah, I really don't like these kind of like fuzzy, vague, big China, like big power ideas about China. I just wish more American people would hear stories at the kind of granular level of individual people. I think maybe what I wish more Americans knew is just that there is a wide range of people in China, like 1.4 billion, living different lives, and that Chinese people, they do have agency and they do have their own thoughts. And that's not just, one thing I report on is, control over speech, over thought, over the education system. But at the same time, they're not robots and they're not monolithic. And that's it.
Yeah, China is not monolithic. That's a profound statement. Yeah, thank you for that, Alice. So, you know what? That's just fabulous. What a great conversation. John, is it possible to turn on the mic for Norm so he can say a word or two?
Yes.
Okay, go ahead.
I think you may have just done that. Thank you.
Okay, good.
Thanks so much, Dorinda. My congratulations to Alice, and my thanks to Barbara, who remains a role model for Los Angeles Times reporters working overseas. Alice, we hired you in the belief that you had extraordinary potential to become one of the great journalists covering China, and it was wonderful to see that potential realized in the range of extraordinary stories you wrote under such difficult conditions last year. I'm convinced the best is yet to come. Thanks also to Los Angeles Times foreign editor Jeff Fleischman, his predecessor Mitchell Landsberg, managing editor Scott Kraft, and all their colleagues in Los Angeles who worked with you. My thanks to Marcus and this year's jurors, and of course to Dinda and the entire Elliott family for all of you at the Asia Society for encouraging great journalism from Asia. The Oz Award and Alice's work also honor the memory of Richard Holbrooke, who, as head of the Asia Society, had the wisdom to create the Oz Award as a way of honoring Oz and recognizing the importance of fearless journalism from Asia. Again, Alice, congratulations.
Thanks.
Thank you, Norm. That's wonderful, wonderful, wonderful. So, Tom, over to you to take us out.
Thank you, Dinda. Thanks all around to Dinda, to Marcus Brauchli, and the full jury of the prize. Norm Perlson, great to hear from you as well. And above all, to Alice Sue, congratulations again to you. I'm just looking at my notes, but among the many insights and points you made, I would particularly thank you for your disdain for what you called the fuzzy and the vague. I did not know Oz Elliott, but I think that's something he, and any good journalist would applaud, because the fuzzy and the vague is all too prevalent, and you cut right through that in your work. So congratulations. Thanks also to all our global members. And as we always do, we like to highlight some of the upcoming stuff, and I'll just do this, which is our only few months old series, Asia Society at the Movies, which, by the way, is free. All you need to do is register, and it comes with a public event. But next up, we have films, a retrospective of the films of the director Ning Hao, including a film that if one more person recommends to me, and some of you might have seen it. It's his 2005 work, Mongolian Ping Pong. I'm going to watch it this weekend. You register, you get 3 days to watch it, June 18th through the weekend, and then a program at the end. But once again, thanks to everyone, and all the best. And we'll see you next time at the Asia Society. Thank you.